As we learn the rules for capitalization, I thought it might be nice just to have a look at some example sentences and kind of learn the rules as we go. Now, some of these rules you probably know from childhood. So, for instance, we always start a sentence with a capital, as we do here. But this word would be capitalized anyways because it's a proper noun. And we tend to capitalize proper nouns. So another example here would be Paris, for instance. And the difference between a proper noun and a common noun is that a common noun is more general. So if we were to use the word city by comparison, city is a common noun, whereas Paris is a specific city. So it's a proper noun. You also notice that adjectives derived from proper nouns are often capitalized. So the art form here would be impressionism. And that's a name, right? A name of an art form. So we capitalize it, as we do with names. But impressionist is this art form that's derived from impressionism, and that's why we capitalize it as well. Now, in a little bit, we'll talk about some tricky cases, and there's one here in the next sentence already, and that's biblical. So biblical comes from Bible. Bible is capitalized, but biblical is not. Okay, so that's kind of a weird one. And as I mentioned, we'll look at some other strange examples in a moment or two. Speaking of the Bible, there are a bunch of religious words that are typically capitalized. As I mentioned, Bible is, but also God. Unless you're talking about what religious people refer to as pagan gods. So these would be gods with a lowercase g. So it pays to kind of respect that tradition. If you're referring, for instance, to Athena, the Greek god, then you would use the lowercase form. There is some dispute about pronouns that refer to God, in Christianity especially. Some people like to capitalize these, God in His infinite wisdom, as a marker of respect. Other people, even some religious people, just use lowercase h, and it's kind of up to you which form you want to follow, but do be aware of that distinction. Let's move on to the next sentence here, and here we learn something about course names. So as you can see, you might be tempted to capitalize the names of courses, but you should only do that really under two conditions. If you're talking about a language course, because the names of languages are always capitalized, or if you're talking about a specific course. So if you're talking about Accounting 101, then you're talking about a specific course and you need to capitalize accounting. But if it's a more general reference, as we have here, then there's no need for the capitalization. As you can see in the next sentence here, we have this reference to romantic, and this is where things are going to get a bit trickier when it comes to these adjectives derived from proper nouns. As I mentioned before, impressionism is one example, but when it comes to historical periods, there's a lot of variation as to whether these adjectives that refer to historical periods are capitalized. Sometimes it's fairly easy. So for instance, the word medieval, which refers to the Middle Ages, not the medieval ages, as I've sometimes seen, but the word medieval is not capitalized. The word Renaissance is kind of tricky. All right, so if you're talking about the Renaissance as a period, yes, you would capitalize it. But if you're using it as an adjective, so if you're talking about a Renaissance text, let's say, a lot of people would capitalize that, but I've sometimes seen it as well without a capital. So that's a bit of a tricky one. And it depends a bit on the field you're in. And that's really where you have to look at the conventions that are in place and try to kind of align your writing and editing with that. If you're using a more distant reference, so if you're talking, for instance, about a Renaissance man, a man who can seemingly do everything, the most interesting man in the world, then a Renaissance man is usually not capitalized because the reference is now just to anybody who has these kinds of Renaissance skills. Other ones that cause trouble are modern and modernist, as well as postmodern. Very often you will see these not capitalized, so that's quite common, and I wouldn't be too upset about which form you choose, but just be aware that there is this kind of dispute about some of these adjectives derived from historical periods. And you can go on, you can talk about Baroque and, lots of other forms. I would typically capitalize romantic, if you're coming back to this, unless you're talking about Valentine's Day and chocolate, in which case you don't need to capitalize romantic. The next thing we're going to talk about is titles. So here we have President Trump, and if your title comes before the name, then we tend to capitalize it. If it comes separate from the name, so here we have Secretary of State, it depends. If you think that the title is of such significance that you really want to capitalize it, then you can do so. And I think Secretary of State is really one of these borderline cases. Obviously an important position, but not quite at the level of President or Prime Minister, let's say. And I think you see people going in multiple directions with this. So that's a borderline case. In the next sentence, we have something much more straightforward. So here we have Dr. Smith, and the title comes before. Yes, we capitalize. Whereas doctor without a name afterwards, we don't really need to capitalize. And you can see that here, the distinction is much clearer. Let's scroll down a little bit here. We have a few more sentences, just when you thought we were done. If you're talking about relationships, so relationships, or names for relationships, then if you are using the name of the relationship or the name of the person instead of the regular name, then you can capitalize it. So if you were to say, we love it when mother would play with us, you could say, we love it when Amy, let's say, if that's your mother's name, would play with us. You can see here that it's really replacing the name. If you were to say, my mother, okay, then you really don't need that capital. You would never say, we love it when my Amy would play with us, right? That doesn't sound quite right. Same thing here with Uncle James. And again, if you find uncle by itself, separate from the name, then you definitely don't need to capitalize it. There is some leeway here, though. For instance, if you were to say something fairly colloquial, like we love it when mum would play with us, I think you can easily get away with not capitalizing it. When it comes to titles of literary works and all sorts of published material, I suppose, we tend to capitalize keywords. So we have, lots of capitals here. I'm not going to get into the specific rules for this kind of capitalization, but the main thing here is that we don't capitalize smaller words like prepositions, let's say. We also don't capitalize seasons, and that's one to watch out for because we tend to fall into this mistake of capitalizing the different seasons of the year, but you don't have to. You also don't have to capitalize directions. Okay, so no directions, unless the direction is acting like a proper noun. So for instance, if you're talking about the Deep South, this geographic area, then you can capitalize it in this case. And the last one here to draw attention to, if there's a brand name that's becoming so common that you're using it as a common noun and not a proper noun, then you can let go of the capital. And that happens more than you think, because often you don't even recognize when you're using a brand name as a common noun. Kleenex is a tricky one, so I think you can get away with the lowercase k, but Microsoft Word does not. It will put a little squiggle underneath, and then you have to decide, am I brave enough to go without the capital? And that's kind of up to you, I suppose. Those are most of the rules for capitalization in English. We've looked at a lot of tricky rules. Hopefully you remember some of this, and there's lots of exercises available on the website to get better at capitalization.